Well, it's great to be here. The Citizens Climate Lobby is a tremendous organization that is very important in Washington, D.C., and I get to see it on a daily basis. So for everything you do, when your organizers and colleagues tell you all about the wonderful things CCL is accomplishing, I can assure you they are not blowing smoke. It's one of the most important organizations in the climate sphere, so thanks for all you do.
All right.
For 20-odd years, I worked in a very different organization. I worked at the Cato Institute, and at that time, I spent most of my career on the other side of this conversation, arguing against people like you. But I came to change my mind. Over time, as a hired gunslinger at Cato, I was responsible for the energy and environmental work that the Cato Institute did. My ambition was to challenge and wrestle with the very best arguments offered by the other side. Now, you need to know this is kind of unusual. Most people in American politics or in the policy world in Washington are not in the business of wrestling with the very best arguments the other side has to offer. And that goes for the left as well as the right. For the most part, people in Washington are in the business of policing their tribe and making sure that everybody holds the line and everybody stays within boundaries and everybody is engaged in acceptable discourse and positions remain where they are within your community. And if that's your objective, you don't need to wrestle with the best arguments at the side. You just need to make sure that everybody continues their tribal affinity for whatever the party line happens to be with the community you're involved in. I had aspired to something a little bit better, which was to go ahead and actually wrestle to the ground the best arguments people like you would forward for climate action. And what I found is that it didn't happen overnight, but over the course of years, I found it increasingly impossible to wrestle these arguments down, so I changed my mind. So I left Cato about 2 years ago to start the Niskanen Center, which is a libertarian think tank here in Washington, D.C. We're still libertarian. We still believe in free markets, individual liberty, and individual autonomy. Our focus at Niskanen is relentlessly at Washington, at elected members of Congress, at their senior staff, and at the important players in this town who influence what they do. Because we believe ultimately policy change happens in Washington, and that's where you need to win hearts and minds most importantly. And of course, the hearts and minds we want to win most immediately in this debate tend to be on the right, because we have won arguments with every other policy community, save for conservatives. And so what the Niskanen Center does is focuses our arguments on them. And I have a little bit of advantage here because I used to be them. So I know exactly what those arguments are, I know where they came from, and I know all their strengths and weaknesses. But I'll give it, to give you a little bit of insight, what was most important in changing my mind about climate, and there were a lot of things, both ethics and the science and the economics, but the most important thing that really had an impact on me is that most of the climate debate is a hot dispute about the most likely outcome. And if you look at the IPCC report and other scientific statements on this, you see a wide range of possible outcomes. The most likely outcome, according to the most recent report from the IPCC, is warming somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius if we double the background concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's the most likely scenario. That's a pretty huge, pretty big range right there. But that's most likely, which means 66% chance. There's a 17% chance it'll be more than 4.5 and a 17% chance it'll be less than 1.5. So you have a huge range of possible outcomes here. And the debate from my own community was to argue that the most likely outcome was at the low end of that potential distribution of outcomes. And it could plausibly be. There's a lot of uncertainty in climate science. And the debate was just most likely outcome, most likely outcome. And I had a meeting a few years ago with a guy from Goldman Sachs who was a concerned climate activist, but otherwise a pretty free market capitalist kind of fellow. And he said, Jerry, we have these kinds of discussions in the financial markets all the time. He said, look, I work at Goldman Sachs. We deal with uncertainty all the time. We deal with a full range of potential outcomes from different investments and different actions all the time. We can't concretely define what the exact risk parameters might be, but that doesn't mean you ignore risk. Risk management is not about finding the optimal solution to the most likely outcome. It's about finding the best solution for the full range of possible outcomes you have. That's what risk management is. And if you do that, then it absolutely compels you to price the risks you're dealing with. And the thing is, conservatives understand this intuitively, because when you're in financial markets, do you plow all your money into stocks and go home? No, nobody would call that conservative, even though that's probably the most likely outcome in any given year. You'll get the most of your return by putting your money in an index fund, 100% stocks. But nobody does that, and nobody who did that would be called conservative. They would be called reckless, because we know there's other outcomes that are quite possible. In foreign policy, when conservatives deal with issues in that arena, they are extremely risk averse. They worry about ISIS. They worry about nuclear weapons in Iran. They worry about Syrian refugees. They worry about a whole host of low probability, high impact scenarios outside of the climate arena. So they understand full well that there are risks in this world and that you cannot ignore them. So why do they ignore them in the climate arena? When they don't ignore them in their private lives, they don't ignore them in other policy arenas, why is it when it comes to the environment, they want to ignore them? And the real reason is, like, to take a page from what Mark just said a moment ago about marriages. So oftentimes in marriages, as some of you know, or some of you are soon going to find out, you might be arguing about something, but what you're really arguing about isn't the topic on the table. It's something else. So for conservatives, for people like me at the Cato Institute and Libertarians, it really wasn't about the science per se. We found ourselves arguing about that. But the real issue is that people on the right worry more about the implications of turning government loose to run fossil fuels out of this economy. And they worry about what that would do to the size of government, and they worry about what that would do to the economy, more than they worry about climate change. That is the fundamental matter. And because of that driving concern, science becomes the conversation. Now, maybe 20 years ago, it was easy for people like me at the Cato Institute to say, oh, you want to see a green energy future? Actually, we can look to the past and see what that looked like. That was called the 12th century. We had tremendous amounts of green energy, and we had no industrial civilization. If you want to know what it would look like in the future, go into Amish country, ask yourself if you want to live there, because they're very green. They don't have very many fossil fuels. Now, the reality is, of course, 20 years later, it turns out there have been tremendous advances in low-carbon technology. Cost production has just plummeted. It's now quite conceivable to imagine a clean energy economy. It is not a backbreaking effort to hedge against climate risk. In fact, the price of hedging against climate risk is far less than the price that we're spending right now to hedge against the risks of Islamic terrorism or all sorts of other things that are constantly engaging our attention in foreign policy. So that's how we go about. So that's how we make our argument to conservatives. There are, of course, other people in this world, the conservatives, who matter. So when Bill argued a moment ago that what's really required is that we rethink how we live our lives as human beings, and we have to rethink the fundamental nature of the human species, that may work with some crowds, but I guarantee you that if you talk to my old crowd, you say, oh, I've got to sign up for changing human species as a whole to do something about climate. Well, check, please. I'm not interested in that game. So I'll end it there, and I look forward to your questions about how to move forward from where we are today.